Well, how about that for a gospel reading for today? If you are feeling old, if you are feeling tired, simply look to Abraham and Sarah for a new lease on life. And if there's any verse that you remember from today's reading, remember the one where God says to Abraham and Sarah, "Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord?" If something seems impossible, if it seems insurmountable, if it seems too sad, too difficult to overcome, remember those words from Genesis chapter 18. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? No. God can and does do the impossible. And one of those impossibly beautiful things, of course, is love. And so for the next just 2 weeks now, we're going to be looking at love stories in the Bible this week and next week. And the week after that, we're going to be heading into Lent. So February, at the beginning of February, before Ash Wednesday, is always kind of time to do a fun series, maybe from the Old Testament, to look at some people that we haven't looked at before in depth, and to look at what love really looks like in the Bible. And so one reason that I wanted to do this series and to look at a couple of couples from the Bible is to talk about what is biblical marriage. So maybe you hear this term kind of tossed out around a lot in politics and media. You want to have biblical marriage. What does biblical marriage really look like? And so what's kind of funny is you look at this cartoon. One way that biblical marriage is frequently portrayed in the Bible is one man, multiple wives, sisters, and concubines. Marriage in the Bible is not often as beautiful and whitewashed as we might imagine it. And although God does set a vision for a beautiful relationship, romantic love between two people, in the Bible, how it actually plays out, we see, especially in the story of Abraham and Sarah, who were half-siblings, that marriage in the Bible is not always as clean and as pretty as we envision it to be. And yet, God still gives us incredible lessons of beauty and grace, even through these imperfect relationships. And so one thing that we can do as we look at our own relationships, our own love stories, we look at these love stories in the Bible to deconstruct our perfect visions of what it might look like to be a love story in the Bible, and instead look at where these broken human relationships are fulfilled and filled with reconciliation through God's faith and God's love. So biblical marriage, yes, was often polygamous, often incestuous, often, like our own relationships, marred by sin. Abraham and Sarah were sinful just as we are in our own relationships, impatient, hard on each other, lying to each other, filled with humor. This is one of the best stories in the Bible because there is laughter. There's laughter, and then Sarah tries to tell God, "No, I didn't laugh," and God says, "No, you did laugh." God sees our humor. It's also filled with humility. Relationships in the Bible come to fruition, come to grace when the two people who are together in love submit themselves to one another. That's what we often miss when we read the New Testament admonitions of Paul, to submit to your husbands, submit to your wives. It's actually a beautiful vision of mutual submission, of mutual humility to one another. And of course, in the Bible, what's surprising sometimes is that traditional gender roles don't always apply, even in the Bible. So let's look at how that plays out with Abraham and Sarah. Now, of course, their marriage was not perfect, what marriage is, but they were transformed by their shared love and their shared faith, which transformed their marriage. And one really interesting thing about the story of Abraham and Sarah, this is really the first sort of love story in the Bible, if you don't count Adam and Eve. Both Abraham and Sarah, when they came together in love, in relationship, and when God came into their lives to give them the promise of generations and of a son, both of them had their names changed. Originally, they were named Abram and Sarai. And when God came to them, he came to Abraham to give Abram the promise of descendants and generations. And he came to Sarai to promise her that even though you are in such advanced age, the Bible says, that you will have a son. And when God came to both of them, he changed both of their names. Now, name changing in the ancient world was incredibly significant because your name said a lot about who you were. And so for both of them to have their names changed, it was a recognition that being in a love-filled relationship changes us. We say, "Oh, you can't the decision on who gets to decide what to watch on TV. Compromise is a part of love, and change is a part of love, and God recognizes this by changing both of their names. Now look at what we do today. We only change the woman's name most of the time, right? But God changed both of their names. I think it's a beautiful recognition of the way that love changes us. Now we decided, of course, not to hyphenate because my maiden name is Bush. So how would it sound? Say Bush Daker. I'm going to get it right. We change. So where did Abram and Sarai falter? If we're looking at these, sort of deconstructing these biblical relationships and looking at the reality of sin and shortcomings that comes even in the midst of that. Well, of course, first in Egypt, Sarai actually holds the position of power. And it was in Sarai's hands that they were able to have their lives saved. So Abram and Sarai are walking into this alien land, the land of the Pharaohs, and they were from a different land. They were from Canaan, which is today sort of where Israel and Palestine are. So as they come upon Pharaoh and his court, they're afraid that they're going to be killed for wandering in a strange land, for being migrants. And instead, Abram goes to Pharaoh and lies and says, "No, this is my sister, this is not my wife." So instead of them both being killed, Sarah is taken and almost used as sort of a slave. They took advantage of her, possibly raped her. She had to sacrifice, go through a horrible event in order that their lives might be spared. And Abram was dishonest. He lied in order to save himself and sacrificed his wife. This must have been horrible betrayal. 10 years later, back in Canaan, Abram and Sarah have survived being in the land of Egypt. They come back to Canaan. They've been given this promise together. They've been given a promise that Sarah will bear a son. They've been given a promise that Abram will be the father of many generations, and yet they are without children and near death. And so Sarah becomes worried, and she begins to take matters into her own hand, and she compels the servant girl, Hagar, to become pregnant with Abram. Now this sounds crazy at first, right? Oh yeah, you go ahead, you come and you be with my husband, and then you can have a son for me. But really, this is not much different than women today. Sometimes if you're not able to have your own children biologically, some women try surrogacy, right? And so this was sort of an old-time, early Old Testament chance, perhaps, at surrogacy. At human beings attempting to say, okay, God's given us this promise. How can we get there on our own? And Hagar did conceive, have a son who was named Ishmael, and he grew to be strong and powerful. But his presence, rather than becoming the son that would fulfill the promise, it drove a wedge between the family. And suddenly there was almost this sort of Genesis-era love triangle created between Abram and Sarah and Hagar. You see fighting in Genesis, in the Bible, between Sarah and Hagar, and Abram is absent. 13 years later, Ishmael is growing up to be a strong young man. Sarah is wondering about the promise. Is there still a promise for her to have a son as well? There is tension and anger in the family. This is not a harmonious, peaceful existence. That's where we read it in chapter 18 today. Angels come to the home and tell Sarah, yes, you will conceive. And of course, she laughs. How could this be possible? Sometimes laughter is a beautiful, joyful thing, right? But sometimes, like in this case, laughter can be a form of scorn. Maybe somebody has a great promise, a great idea for you, and you laugh in their face. You dismiss it right out of hand. This is a little bit what Abram and Sarah were doing to God. They laughed. They dismissed the idea that God could have something wonderful. For them, it was a scornful laughter. And so we've had so much faltering in this relationship. We've had cheating, betrayal, lies, broken relationship, even a love triangle. So why is this a love story after all? How are Abram and Sarah redeemed? 1 year later, Ishmael turns 14, and Sarah becomes pregnant with Isaac. Now, this begins a surprising trend in the Bible, because Isaac is the younger son of Abram. And yet Isaac is chosen to become the bearer of the promise of the people who will become the Jewish people. Now Ishmael is also given a secondary promise. He's told he will have his own people as well, and they will have a land in which to live. But Isaac becomes the bearer of the same promise that was given to Abraham. And what's interesting is that throughout the book of Genesis, the promise continues to go to the younger son. This subverts everything that we believe about heritage, about succession. The eldest son, the eldest child, look at even in Great Britain today, will be the heir. And yet God chooses the younger child. God is always surprising us, turning our expectations upside down, choosing the one who we didn't think would be chosen, choosing us when we didn't think would be chosen. So God begins to turn the expectations upside down. In the midst of this new promise, Abraham and Sarah, despite the lies, despite the betrayal, in light of this new wonderful promise, they forgive one another. God forgives them even for the horrible lie and betrayal, the scornful laughter. Hagar forgives too. The love triangle is broken as Hagar and Ishmael are able to start a new life with a promise of God that is for them in a new land. And later Sarah even forgives Abraham for after she's had this child, the child of the promise. Just as a young boy, Abraham then takes him outright and binds him because he's told by God to sacrifice his own son. And yet the thread of faith that continued all the way from the beginning sustains their marriage and sustains a nation and sustains a people of faith. I love this picture here because look at that. It's Abraham and Sarah, and you can see they don't really look like new parents, right? They look more like grandparents or great-grandparents. And you know what, guys? Who knows? Who knows exactly how old they were? Perhaps the writers of Genesis exaggerated their ages for effect. But the exaggeration comes to tell a greater truth, that nothing is too wonderful for God. That even a woman who's 100 years old and is no longer in the way of the manner of women. Ladies, I guess we know what he's talking about. That nothing is too wonderful for God. That new life can come even when we thought everything is dead. And that's the message of Abraham and Sarah. We read the end of the story in chapter 23. Sarah dies and is buried. And there's this curious little line. Genesis chapter 23, verse 2. Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. I don't know how many of you grew up this way. I know lots of male friends and guys that I know who grew up that crying is not something that you do. That you hide your emotions. That to be a strong man doesn't mean to cry. And yet here in Genesis, thousands and thousands of years ago, this paragon of faith, the father of 3 major world religions, Abraham, went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. God is saying something here about love. That traditional gender roles don't always apply in love, because when you love someone, sometimes you do weep for them. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you weep, sometimes you're angry. But Abram, you can see really, he loved Sarah. The last line we hear is about his deep love, not about his betrayal, not about all the terrible things that tore their marriage apart, that tore the relationship apart, but instead about his emotional love for his wife. So I want to conclude for these next 2 weeks. We're going to have some sweetheart messages. Remember the little candies that have messages them, has some sweetheart messages to take with you about these love stories of the Bible, and today about Abraham and Sarah. So the first sweetheart, look at, a little unorthodox, it says dishonesty and betrayal on it. And that reminds us that even in the Bible, these supposedly idyllic relationships, that there is dishonesty, there is betrayal. But that doesn't have to be the end of the relationship. But that there is brokenness in our world, brokenness in our relationships. And when we confront that brokenness, when we forgive one another, that is when new life can begin, as it did for Abraham and Sarah. The next little sweetheart says, in very small type, transformation through faith. That each one of us is transformed. Each one of us, theoretically, our names are changed when we enter into love with another person. We are changed. We are transformed in loving somebody else. Surprise is joyful. God surprises us. God doesn't do what we think that God is going to do. God chooses the younger son when we thought the oldest was in line. God decides to zig when we want to zag. God just has different plans than we could ever imagine. And yet, if we embrace those new surprises, those new plans with joy, then we are living into the promise that God has given us. And finally, sweethearts from Abraham and Sarah, real men love emotionally. It's okay to express our emotions. And sometimes women have a hard time doing this too. But the kind of love God calls us to, the self-sacrificing, humble love, is a love that expresses itself, that isn't afraid to cry, isn't afraid to share emotions. Because real love is a love that is full of faith, love that is full of sacrifice, a love that is full of surprises, and a love that puts its faith in the foundation of Jesus, who died and rose again, that we might have new life and new love. Let us pray. God, I give you thanks for Abraham and Sarah, for the ways that their love story at times disappoints us, at times surprises us, but ultimately reminds us that the strongest thing is not human love, but God's love, and our ability to be transformed by that love. In your name we pray.